we'll hear from Emily now, and there's just one thing I want to say, lest I forget it. We got a submission from Emily, and it's on the website in the submissions process, and of course it has a wider scope than what she's going to talk about now. I downloaded it during the week, and I would suggest that you should also consult it, but I just wanted to remind you of that.
Good afternoon, everybody. Justice Lafoy, Citizens Assembly, thank you so much for the opportunity to represent the views of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission with you today. I'm just going to start with just giving you a sense of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm here today with Dr. Mary Murphy at the end here, who also has a background, not only a long-standing background in equality, but also as a political scientist and somebody who straddles unusually both the humanities and economics. So what we're going to try and do is just to complement what you heard this morning, but perhaps give you not a model to think about, but an approach to think about. So we're going to start with telling you a little bit about the Human Rights and Equality Commission so that you understand where our comments are coming from. We're going to talk about the human rights and equality standards that exist in Ireland and internationally. And then I'd like to introduce you to something called the public sector duty here in Ireland. And then I'm going to hand over to Mary, who's going to talk specifically about equality and human rights concerns related to pension. And then again, more detail about pension and gender equality. And what we've tried to do under Sharon's great guidance is to confine ourselves to 3 key recommendations for your consideration. So just in terms of the organisation, just to be clear about who we are, we're a group of 15 members of the Commission, and this photograph is the day that we were appointed by President Michael D. Higgins in the Oireachtas. So we are an institutionally independent statutory body. And what that means essentially is that we don't work for government and we don't report to government, and we're part of the state's infrastructure. So we are a national equality and human rights body that independently monitor and look to the promotion and protection of human rights and equality here in Ireland. And we were established in November 2014, and we report directly. Obviously, we're publicly accountable, and while we account directly to the Oireachtas for our functions, we also have what's called a voted account. So we have 42 staff, a commission of 15, and we account directly to the Oireachtas for our public expenditure as well as our functions. And we're also accredited as an A, a little bit like the nuns at school giving you an A, B or C. Essentially, the United Nations give you an A, B or C depending on the strength of the legislation that you work to and the independence of your institution. So we got an A, which means that we can speak before any of the human rights treaty monitoring bodies. And that's important in terms of Ireland's international reputation on human rights. So in terms of some of the standards that we're looking to constitutional standards and the existence, as Justice Lafoy said in our paper, on some of the articles in the Constitution that guarantee fundamental rights. The second is what's called the European Convention of Human Rights. This is more a contemporary model of human rights that emerged after the Second World War, after we demonstrated our propensity as human beings to harm each other. This was when 47 countries, strangely, ironically led by Winston Churchill, led the charge in terms of setting some regional standards on human rights for governments. And the third one is the UN treaties. So there are a series of 10 treaties that look very specifically at different groups and their needs. Now, here in Ireland, the age-related discrimination is prohibited in our equality legislation, and it's prohibited in Employment Equality Acts and also in our Equal Status Acts, which cover goods and services. But there's also, I suppose, an international trend now moved to a little bit like we're experiencing in Ireland, where globally everybody recognises that older people require something distinct in terms of a distinct lifestyle, opportunity, and a statement of strategy that is positive, that focuses on the positives of ageing and the contribution that older people make to their societies. And the second one is about the possible vulnerability, so possible reduced capacities, and where states and governments need to protect certain groups of people in the event of them having reduced capacity. Now, central to the idea of human rights is very simply put, it's rooted in the idea that we're all equally worthy of esteem. And generally, esteem manifests itself in law and policy in what are called negative obligations. So states are asked not to do certain things, and not to discriminate is one of those. But here you see the two words. If I were to ask you to think about the lens through which you might consider some of the things we're saying today, is essentially about human dignity. It's about that respect of the human person and what it means for you as you grow older, what dignity means for you as you grow older. And internationally, the United Nations suggests that the right to social security is of central importance in guaranteeing human dignity. Now, the concept that I want to introduce you to, again, is something that is about the lens through which we might either write laws, develop policies that will hopefully mean that the experience and the practice of people on the ground is improved. And it's something called the public sector duty. And the public sector duty was introduced in the law that established our commission in November 2014. And essentially it does three things. It places an obligation on all public bodies in the country to do three things. The first is to eliminate discrimination. The second is to promote equality of opportunity and treatment for everybody to whom you provide a service. And then the third is to protect human rights of members and the persons to whom you provide services. Now, at the moment, some of that seems a little bit abstract. And when we set up the Commission, we surveyed over 1,000 people who said, we kind of get equality, but we're not sure if we get human rights. So if I suggest to you that you consider some key principles, those principles are about respect, they are about dignity. One of the very live examples at the moment of that was the case of Kathleen and Michael Devereux. And if you saw the administrative action in terms of administering the Fair Deal scheme, what resulted was what the Taoiseach described as an act of inhumanity. So was there a need for that to happen? And we would suggest as a Commission that if the public body making that decision had a policy that was flexible enough, that there are possibilities to consider individual cases on the basis of a more humane approach to providing, in this context for the Devereux, it was in the context of providing care for them. So there are two things I want to mention about public sector duty. One is you'll be well aware of the increased propensity to outsource health and social care services, and that includes services for older people. It includes home care, it includes palliative care. Now, when the state outsources, as you know, there's millions being spent on outsourcing, but what we would say to you is that the state does not abrogate its responsibility. It doesn't outsource its responsibility when it outsources a particular service. And that's what the public sector duty is about. It's about trying to think of a culture. So human rights and equality is not just about law, it's about more than that. It's about when you make the decision that you consider the interests of the individuals about whom you're making that decision. And the second one, just to pick up on a comment Justin made in relation to voices of people, a very fundamental principle of human rights is what's called participation. So the idea is nothing about us without us. You don't make decisions about people without consulting with them. And we did have a very good and very positive statement by the then Minister for Older People about consultation in relation to home care. And what I would say is, I suppose, is to give you a word of caution around that we need to be careful when we consult with people or when we do these campaigns, that we ensure that the primary interest, that the primary consideration is the people about whom the public policy is being made. In this case, it's about older people. So it's not satisfying the carers, it's not about satisfying the families. And I say that as somebody who had a very personal experience with my mother who was dying at home, where we were absolutely dedicated, committed family. There are 9 of us. We were all killing ourselves to be doing as much as we possibly could. But the best advocate when my mother got sicker was our GP, the person who stood up and had a very clear, absolute clear focus on what was in her interest. So I suppose my message in relation to participation and hearing people's voices is that it's not about us deciding what's best for people. It's in the first instance asking people themselves what they think is in the interest of older people in Ireland. So any participation should in the first instance ask older people themselves. I'm going to hand over now to Mary Murphy, who's going to go into the detail of pensions. Thanks, Mary.